Good evening, I'm Jay Aiyer.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus.
Welcome to Houston Public Media's web series, Political Perspectives. Tonight we'll continue the conversation from Red, White, and Blue about the state of the city with Mayor Sylvester Turner. Let's get started. Brandon, we had a great conversation, or the folks at Red, White, and Blue had a great conversation with Mayor Turner about the state of the city, the first 150 days. What was your take? What was your impression on kind of how he did and how things are looking in these first 150 days?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is the mayor came into office understanding that the problems were going to be pretty serious, but things changed really quickly, right? We had flooding, which obviously wasn't expected. We had a major jump in the amount of money that was owed to the pensions from about 3 during the mayor's campaign to something like 5.5. So this is a huge jump in terms of the obligation. So a lot of things have changed even since he was elected. I think, frankly, he's handled it pretty well, but if I were grading him, I'd probably give him an incomplete, right? Because we don't know the universe of what's going to happen, and a lot of these problems are still up in the air, and some of them are outside of his control. Beyond that, I think I'd probably give him an A- on a curve because we've seen a lot of success, and I think that overall, addressing issues like flooding with the new flood czar, Steve Costello, I think the issues with respect to the budget, closing the budget gap, even with some sort of small short-term fixes, are still successful. Negotiating with council and getting things, I think, in place for a long-term strategy to fix some of these problems, I think he's doing pretty well. So that's my impression. What's your impression? How would you grade him so far?
I would give him, and I know this sounds crazy for some people, I'd give him an A+, and I'll tell you why. I've seen sort of the process over the last few years in terms of different mayors, and I served in Mayor Brown's administration. This might be the best 150 days I've ever seen. Came into office in sort of some difficult circumstances. The circumstances are now worse than I think anyone would have imagined, right? Just sort of, I mean, you've got the nexus of an infrastructure meltdown in terms of the street conditions. You had flooding, and then and as you said, so the budgetary situation ended up being worse than we thought. And he did it in a way that I think surprised people, which is not just on time; it was actually ahead of time, and got council's buy-in. It's the first unanimous budget cycle we've had really in probably, I think, 7-8 years. It's been a very, very long time. It's hard for me to imagine what he frankly could have done better. I think there's been, some grumbling to some extent, right? There's been some criticism that's been levied at him for not moving fast enough, really on the appointment hiring side. So I personally disagree with that, but I'm curious, from your perspective, do you think there's any value to that, any merit to that part?
Yeah. I mean, the mayor had a nice comment, I think, when some of this reaction to the short-termitis of this mayorship, and he said, if you become director of a cruise ship, you can't just tell everyone to get off, right, and then bring on new people. Exactly. It takes a while, and I think there's something to that. I think the city is involved in enough problems that it makes it difficult to solve any one of them at any one time, and so every problem is going to get a little bit of support. And I think the real complication here is that a lot of these things are outside of his control, right? The budget, obviously, he has some serious say over, but he's still got to negotiate with council. He's still going to have to take a lot of these issues to the legislature. He may have to go to the voters for some issues like revenue cap, like they talked about. So there are a lot of things that are outside of his control. So keeping his efforts at making sure that all these different things are not losing any support and keeping all the balls in the air is what I think a good administrator does. But you've been on the ground, and like you said, I mean, you worked in the Brown administration, so you've seen this happen from the front lines. How do you prioritize these issues, right? Like you say, you've got budget issues, you've got pension issues long-term, you've got the potential for flooding and maybe even more coming up, you've got transportation issues, you've got police issues. Where do you start? I mean, if you're advising the mayor, what's your sort of perspective in terms of where he ought to get going, and how do you frame that in terms of your view of his success so far? Well,
I think he came into office with the idea of wanting to rebuild confidence in local government, right? That government could work again. I think there was a general sense in the last couple of years that the streets weren't fixed, that we had issues with the Rebuild Houston, that we've had these pension problems, that sort of we've had this sort of collection of calamities that were happening. So I think his first step was, look, you can't ask for more money without getting things working right. The pothole thing, in terms of being able to fill potholes within a 24-hour period might go down as one of the more bold promises.
Right.
And the ability to fulfill that and make it work, I think, surprised a lot of people.
Did you think that bought him some political capital? I mean, it's important in tennis to get your first serve in, right? And so you have to be able to set the stage. Does that buy him capital? I mean, is this honeymoon temporary? Is it more permanent? What do you view? How do you view that as in terms of the universe of his promises?
Well, I mean, he made that promise, and then he managed to be able to deliver on it, which I think surprised everyone. So I think the expectations were relatively low that he was going to, and I think he far exceeded it. The same thing with the budget. I don't think people thought it would be as easy. Now, the challenge for him is he's kind of made it look easy so far. And I wonder sometimes, because now we're getting to the really hard part, right? He's laid out a pretty ambitious kind of multi-year plan, right? He's talked about it. I think he talked about it that by October he wanted a deal on pensions, and then he was going to, whatever deal that's going to happen, he's going to have to take it to the legislature, where there's an entirely different political environment there. Get it passed, and if that passes, he wants to lift revenue cap and the November 17 ballot. And so that creates all sorts of interesting dynamics. The politics are different. How does term limits come into play into this? Because that's a big part of this, right?
This is a big question, right? Because the voters approved changing the term limit so that it's not a 2-year term for mayor; it's now a 4-year term.
We use the term approved euphemistically.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Because this is still being battled in the courts, and so we don't exactly know what the final outcome will be. Part of the concern is the ballot language was confusing, so we'll see how that all shakes out. But assuming it's a 4-year term, I think he's planning for that because the kind of solutions he's putting into place do keep him on pace for a long-term set of solutions. And I think that's probably the smart thing to do here. And I think the good news is, generally speaking, that Houston's economy is better than some other places. There's been some sluggishness with respect to sales tax revenue, and obviously, oil being down creates some complications. But in terms of the generality, things are moving in the right direction. But there's this old sort of joke about Texas, and people said that all Texans had 4 Cadillacs, one for each direction, right? Economic times aren't that great. So how does the economics of the present, but also perhaps the future, play into his political solutions and to his sort of long-term financial solutions for the city? Does that have an effect on the kinds of proposals that he puts out there when he goes to the legislature? How does he make this bargain with them? And then how does he convince the people on the ground here, both the pension holders as well as the voters, to be able to sort of persuade them that there's some kind of a stronger relationship between them and their government? So how does the fiscal situation kind of play into all these factors?
It's hard because he's got to get a deal with folks, and they have to give him something back, right? So he's going to have to be able to trade, and there's going to be, as he said, he talks about shared sacrifice, but at the end of the day, it's really they're trading off one benefit for another, right? Short versus long, et cetera. Then he's got to take that deal, sell it to the legislature, which I think will be relatively easy for him if he can get a deal from the 3 pension funds. And then he's going to have the final piece, which is to convince the voters. Now, right now, he's created a timeline for 2017. Well, as we said, if he is going to be on the ballot in 2017, whether he's opposed or not, I think it complicates it. It'll be an interesting scenario for him because the overall economy, as you said, we're probably, if oil is north of 60, 70 by then, probably not an issue. If it drops from 50 the way it is today down to 30, we're back in this again with declining sales tax kind of coming into play. So
It's a really good point. We're going to come off a legislative session, too, at that point, where you're going to have some kind of serious hotness with respect to, like, property taxes. And so that's going to be a big issue. If the voters are still in the mindset that that's the most important thing and that, we're going to cut taxes and keep those low no matter what, it's going to be tough for him to convince voters, no matter the quality of the argument, that that's going to happen. So do you think that that's going to be an issue from the timing of the potential election there to coming off of the legislative session?
Yeah, I mean, what happens in the legislature, we don't know. We don't know what the tenor and the tone is going to be. I mean, there's all sorts of issues already cropping up. Suddenly, things like Uber and gender identification is now a statewide issue, right? National issue. So we don't know. So that's certainly going to make a play. But I want to close out with one last thought. I know he was criticized for moving slowly on hiring and appointing people. I think the real story is, how has he managed to get the same employees to seemingly work that much better? Because I think by all measures, things are working better at City Hall than they've probably been in a while. And I think he probably should be credited for that. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Thank you for watching the program. Remember to log on to HoustonPublicMedia.org/perspectives every Friday night at 8 p.m. following the 7:30 broadcast of Red, White, and Blue.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again next week.